The other question that I think is fundamentally linked to the climate change challenge, which isn't really talked about at the moment, and which is really a very important part of the sustainability and environmental debate, is the whole question of inequality. And there are several reasons for this, and I think at the global level, and the one which will be most politically charged at the Copenhagen summit, is the difference between the poorest people in the world and the richest people in the world in terms of the environmental impact they cause, and what that then implies for the kind of treaty that's going to be necessary to solve this particular problem of climate change. So one statistic that I think kind of sums it up in the global sense is how 86% of the world's present energy and resource consumption is accounted for by 20% of the people. Looking at the other end, the bottom 20% of people are responsible for about 1.5% of global consumption of energy and natural resources. So I think this poses really quite a fundamental challenge. Again, if one goes back to the climate science and looks at what's required by when in terms of this quick deceleration in terms of environmental impact, I don't think you can credibly make an argument that says we can all come up to Western living standards, or at least Western levels of consumption. I think standard of living is something different. Western levels of consumption at the same time as accommodating these goals. Now, poverty alleviation is often thrown on the table as the trump card by some of those who argue for the status quo in terms of we've got to continue with old patterns of development because these poor people need growth in order to be able to improve their well-being. But I think if you look at the way the environmental impact is distributed in the globe at the moment, never mind the wealth, I think that argument has deep flaws, especially when one considers how it is increasingly the case that climate change is not something you do separate to poverty alleviation. Climate change is something that's going to make poverty alleviation more difficult in many parts of the world in terms of food security, access to natural resources, damage to property and everything else. And if you look at the number of deaths that have occurred in the world in the last 30 years as a result of natural disasters, they tend to be in developing countries. So poverty alleviation and impact on the poor from climate change is likely to be particularly heavy. The poorest will be hit first and hardest is what the development groups say, and I think all the data adds up there. So how are we going to solve this inequality? How are we going to be able to lift up the bottom of global society at the same time as reducing the environmental impact at the top? And it's not only in terms of the global picture, I would argue, that inequality is a huge part of the challenge. I think in this part of the world as well, the increasing inequalities that we've seen in Europe, including in this country, look at the bank bonuses compared to the people living on benefits. The top and bottom of our society has been stretched out even more in recent years. And this is an environmental problem, not least because of the politics this generates. And I had a very interesting conversation recently with a former Swedish environment minister, and I asked her why in the UK we were finding it so difficult to do some of the things that have happened in Scandinavia a long time ago in terms of building a very efficient, a very green society where the culture is green and people buy in to this agenda. And aside from some of the things that are particularly cultural in that part of the world, the Swedes spend a lot of time, swimming in lakes and saunas and rolling in the snow. They're kind of, nature people in that sense. She explained to me that a big part of it is about the equality of Swedish society and how it is possible to gain political consent for some of these changes because you don't have the backlash from those who feel as though this is some kind of punishment against poor people. So in this country, the fuel tax protests of 2000, some of the arguments that have been made about the impact on poor people arising from moving from cars to public transport, some of the things that are said about product prices as we put environmental standards on industry. Those kinds of political problems tend to occur less in countries that are more equal, because everybody feels as though they're part of the society and they're all mucking in, and they're not being disproportionately impacted by something which is a middle-class concern. How many times have you heard in your own kind of conversations that the environment here is a middle-class concern? People go to Waitrose and buy organic food. Well, it's okay for them, they're rich people who can afford this, but for me, an ordinary person, I can't really participate. Inequality, I think, is therefore, and that's just one anecdote from one country, a really serious part of the agenda and the challenge that we have to face in this country. And, this is not just something which is about, the moving of resources across society for whatever mechanisms we might have to make it more equal in terms of favouring the lower end. I think those societies that have achieved high levels of equality, they generate a lot of data that tells us actually they are some of the most successful societies in the world. Yes, they have high levels of taxation, but they have very low levels relatively in terms of social stress. They have high levels of well-being, they have a nice environment, they have strong communities, but they have very dynamic businesses, they have healthy export markets. So there is a lot of evidence there, I think, that tells us that this is beyond an environmental issue. We should want to do this anyway, because the people who benefit from a more equal society are not just the poor, they're everybody. And anybody who spent some time maybe in Rio de Janeiro or Johannesburg, as I've done over the years, and seeing the way in which the rich people have to live behind barbed wire and security gates, you can see some of that in London now. Perhaps we should think this is not a society we would like to live in, and perhaps see the attractions of a green one, a more equal one, as being part of the same package. So, alongside the economic challenges, I would argue that the grossly unequal and divided world that we live in today is also unsustainable, and that we need to be taking active steps to deal with that as well. So what are the kinds of things that could be done in a policy sense? What could politicians do to begin to move us in that direction? And what really should be the agenda flowing out of Copenhagen after the climate change summit? Well, just a couple of ideas. So one thing we could do is measure differently. I think we've reached the point now where it's pretty clear that we're probing the limits of GDP growth as a socially beneficial way of measuring our performance as a society. And there's a whole vast literature out there. I'd encourage you to look at some of the things published by the New Economics Foundation in terms of how we could be looking to grow things that aren't necessarily GDP. So we might want to be growing happiness, we might want to be growing longevity, we might want to be growing community cohesion, we want to probably grow resource efficiency, we want to grow the way in which we can produce energy without putting carbon emissions into the atmosphere. There's lots of things we might want to grow. This is not about a no-growth agenda. I think this is much more about measurement and the things we actually do want to do compared to the so-called externalities we might wish to avoid. There's plenty of metrics that have been produced on this. The Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare is one, which tries to bring in some of these aspects of what actually makes for a good society. The New Economics Foundation recently published also a study looking at actually what makes people happy. And we've become encouraged, possibly in Western societies, to think that the amount of consumption, the amount of stuff that we can have, and the status we gain from that is the principal source of happiness. NEF now present evidence telling us that actually it's the quality of our relationships, so whether we have friends and family, it's about the extent to which we're active and feel as though we're part of a society. It's about the things we give to other people, not the kind of things that are measured in any kind of mainstream economic analysis. Is it beyond the creativity and wit of humankind to begin to build an economy that could be measuring some of those things rather than simply the amount of energy and stuff that's being sold and which is going ultimately and increasingly quickly into a landfill? I think that's one of the big challenges that comes from the Copenhagen agenda, and I think that's something that we should be focusing on as one of the key political discussions of the coming years. How can we begin to measure differently in a way which actually reflects human needs as well as the capacity of the planet?